All right, welcome everybody. We'll give it a few minutes here for people to file into the meeting, and then we'll get started soon. All right, well, I think we can get started here. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this exciting webinar today. I'm Scott Brandenburg, a professor at UCLA and one of the co-PIs for Design Safe, and part of my role is to help organize webinars. We're really excited to have a Dataset award-winning webinar today. These are always really fun and I learn a lot from them. So I'll just do a real quick introduction and we'll dive right in here. Let's see. All right, so first we will be conducting a survey so that we can get your feedback. We're always looking to improve our webinars, and if there's logistics that didn't go well, we also like to hear when things do go well and get positive feedback too. So I'll put the QR code up at the end as well, and hopefully you can all complete that survey. So today we have with us Mary Painter. Melissa couldn't make it today, and we have Laurie Peak and Chani Singh, and they'll be presenting on their Dataset award for this State Hazard Mitigation Plans and Social Vulnerability Project, which is ID PRJ 4241 in the Design Safe published area. So thanks very much to all of you for being here. So Mary is a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center. I think she'll be doing the bulk of the presenting, and then Laurie and Chani will also provide some of the presentation here. So her work is driven by a philosophy of collaboration where the community, decision makers, researchers, and everyday people are involved in finding solutions together. Laurie is a professor in the Department of Sociology and the director of the Natural Hazard Center. She established the Converged Data Ambassadors Program and has co-published many data sets and social science research instruments on Design Safe. I'm personally really excited to see the social science community adopting Design Safe and the natural hazards aspects related to that. And Chani is an undergraduate research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center at the Biomod Lab at the University of Colorado. Thanks very much, Chani, for being here. I think you may be the first undergraduate to be participating in a webinar, so that's awesome. Kind of a trailblazer. All right, so today we'll hear about the State Hazard Mitigation Plans and Social Vulnerability. I won't read through this whole abstract because they're going to present on it. So I think at this time, I will stop my share and hand it over to Mary.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that great introduction. Let me get my PowerPoint slide up on the screen here, and I think we're ready to go. Laurie, thumbs up. You can see the slides. Okay, amazing. Thank you for that introduction, Scott. Just as a reminder, my name is Dr. Mary Angelica Painter, and I am a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center. I'm joined today by Dr. Laurie Peak, our esteemed director, and the most wonderful Chani Singh, who's an undergraduate research assistant with us as well. Dr. Melissa Villarreal could not be with us today. She had a last minute conflict, but she's still a research affiliate with us, although she does have a new postdoctoral position that she is flying high with. So hopefully you all, if you have not met her, get to meet her in the future. And today I am going to talk about state hazard mitigation plans and the incorporation of social vulnerability. So if you don't know what either of those things are, that's okay. We will describe them for you. Just to give a lay of the land of what our presentation will go through, we're going to start by talking about the motivation of our research specifically and the research team that really helped with compiling this data together for Design Safe. Then we want to get into the specifics about state hazard mitigation plans and social vulnerability. Again, I will be defining those terms for you, and we'll be talking to you how those things are linked together, our methods for data collection, and then we have a short preview of our findings as well. I'll also have links on the screen and pictures up of the resources for our data and our findings, including our Design Safe data set. And so with that, I'm passing it over to Ms. Lori Peak, Dr. Lori Peak.
Thank you, Mary, and just wanted to echo Mary and thanks so much to Scott and Design Safe for recognizing our work in this way with the Dataset Award. We're really honored to be here today. So to begin with the motivation for this project, which was actually launched about 2 years ago to the date. So we know that socially vulnerable groups and populations have less power and fewer resources, financial as well as otherwise, that makes it more difficult to prepare for, respond to, and recover from natural hazards. So for example, older adults or people age 65 and older are oftentimes recognized as a socially vulnerable group. How that actually plays out in actuality in disasters was evidenced harshly and starkly in Hurricane Katrina, where some 1,300 people lost their lives in New Orleans in that tragic storm. And of those who perished in the disaster, about 67% of the deaths were among people age 65 and older, even though that group made up only about 12% of the pre-storm population. So we recognize that social vulnerability as a concept can appear as sort of a list of words on a screen, but we never want to lose sight of the real world impacts of what it means to have fewer resources that make it more difficult to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disaster. Next bullet, please. With that concept in mind, we know that social vulnerability is oftentimes overlooked in hazard mitigation planning, and we know very little about what works for engaging these populations in risk reduction efforts. And so we set out in this project, next bullet please, to try to fill this knowledge gap. And so we applied for and received funding from a philanthropic funder that wished to remain unnamed to review and assess policy, programs, and practices that are dedicated to lessening social vulnerability and ultimately reducing hazard risk. Next slide, please. And so the research team that worked on this effort, that is so important to recognize, that philanthropic funding actually brought Dr. Mary Angelica Painter to the Natural Hazard Center as a postdoctoral research associate to serve as the project lead on this project. And Mary has since been promoted to a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center. Melissa Villarreal joined this project while still a graduate student at the Natural Hazard Center and ultimately graduated soon after completing this project and her dissertation. And Chani Singh joined us midway as an undergraduate research assistant, and I served as principal investigator on the project. Next slide, please. And so next, Mary and I are going to dive a little deeper and give some additional context on this project. And so we wanted to begin by talking about what is a state hazard mitigation plan. Next slide, please. So in answer to this question, and next bullet, please. State Hazard Mitigation Plans, or SHMPs, as we fondly refer to them, as do many others, actually establish programs, projects, and protocols for how states will lessen harm from natural hazards using long-term strategies for risk reduction. Next bullet, please. And SHMPs are incredibly important because they ultimately set priorities at the state as well as local level for various activities such as deciding which infrastructure is actually deemed critical, as well as determining the specific populations that may need extra protection from harm. Next bullet, please. And FEMA requires every state, tribal area, and territory to develop an SHMP, which must be updated, reviewed, and hopefully ultimately approved every 5 years. And this is quite important because a locality must have an SHMP in place in order to apply for disaster relief grants as well as funding for disaster mitigation. And so one of my former graduate students, Lucy Carter, actually did an analysis of SHMPs that were adopted by tribal populations, and she found that only about 30% of the 500 plus federally recognized tribes in this nation actually have federally approved SHMPs. And this really matters again, because if those federally recognized tribes do not have these plans in place, again, they're not eligible for post-disaster relief grants and also will lose out on funding for disaster mitigation activities. So having these plans in place, which oftentimes requires time, resources, capacity, and expertise, is vitally important. Next slide, please. And so importantly, states as well as counties, again, tribal areas, and the 5 inhabited U.S. territories need to have an improved hazard mitigation plan, again, to receive this vital funding for mitigation. And so for states and territories, which were the focus of this project, as you'll hear more about in a moment, funding opportunities that can become unlocked once an SHMP is approved include opportunities such as the accessing the BRIC, or the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities funding, which allows for capacity building, encouraging innovation, and supporting partnerships for hazard risk reduction, the HMGP, or Hazard Mitigation Grant Program through FEMA, as well as the Flood Mitigation Assistance, or FMA, as well as the Fire Mitigation Grants programs through FEMA. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to turn this back over to Mary Angelica, who is going to discuss our core concept of interest in this project, which is social vulnerability.
Thank you, Lori. That was such a great introduction to SHMPs. And thank you for setting the stage with that, what I'll call a data story around Hurricane Katrina and the vulnerability of elderly populations when it comes to natural hazards. So social vulnerability, what is social vulnerability? So it is a term that is used to describe how historical, social, economic, political, and cultural dimensions might influence the ability of people, or even entire groups and populations and areas, to be able to prepare for, cope with, and recover from a natural hazards event. One of the populations that Lori Peak talked about was elderly, but this can also include populations like children or the disabled population, but it can also define other factors. So there can be place-based categories such as tribal areas or even rural areas, or even other factors that relate to household and individuals' preparedness to combat the impacts of natural hazards, such as if they have a vehicle or not. Socially vulnerable populations, too, can experience worsening inequalities that already exist in the wake of a disaster or a natural hazard. So they're already facing these inequalities in their everyday life, and these impacts from natural hazards can exacerbate those inequalities or worsen conditions that were already bad in the first place. But it's important to understand social vulnerability, especially in emergency management, because it can help to not only identify these populations, so naming those elderly, children, disabled people, and other populations, but also locating those populations and working with those communities to try to figure out how to reduce harm that is caused by these events. So why do we want to link social vulnerability to state hazard mitigation plans? Like, why is this a useful paradigm when we think about reducing harm in the context of hazards? So in 1988, the Stanford Act, and in 2000, the Disaster Mitigation Act helped to create the framework for hazard mitigation planning, both at the state level, tribal area, and territory, as we've been discussing, but there's also local hazard mitigation plans as well that were a part of these legislations. And they have a basic formula for understanding how to combat these harms or reduce risk for the populations or for states, including the state assets, as Lori brought up earlier. It's to help to organize resources and mitigation planning process. You can write it down, create tables, develop flow charts, do those sorts of things to help prepare for when an event happens, how there will be responses, as well as mitigation too. It's to also assess risk using data and qualitative research as well to understand the heightened risk within a state, territorial, or tribal area. It's also to help develop that mitigation strategy. So some of that organizational tools can go, and those assessments risk can go into developing that strategy. And it's also meant to adopt and implement the plan as well. So although those are updated every 5 years, these plans are meant to be referred back to for mitigation efforts throughout the life cycle of that 5 years of the plan's existence. But where social vulnerability fits in, I promise I was getting to it, is in this assessing risk point. What social vulnerability can help do is to understand where there's heightened levels of risks among populations within these areas in order to mitigate harms and impacts. But importantly, as of April 2023, there were additional changes to the guidance for state hazard mitigation plans coming down from FEMA. There was 2 major changes that happened, and the first one is that states and territories and tribal areas needed to incorporate climate change within their assessments for mitigation. And the second was equity. There would need to be some form of equity considerations in these state hazard mitigation plans when it comes to reducing harm for populations. And because of those new guidelines, social vulnerability can be used to help improve alignment with those guidelines for reducing risk for these populations. So that's why it's kind of an important concept to be able to be built into state hazard mitigation plans or mitigation planning generally. So I want to get more into what we know about hazard mitigation planning and social vulnerability, but for that, we're going to pass it back to Lori.
Thank you. And just quickly wanted to acknowledge I'm so sorry, we had a small typo on our slides that should have said Stafford Act instead of Stanford. And so we will correct that and send that to Scott, so apologies. So now I'm going to transition to this, what we know about hazard mitigation planning and social vulnerability, as Mary Angelica noted. And this really was at the root of this project, which was actually initiated before FEMA issued this new guidance to states and localities, encouraging them to integrate equity or vulnerability considerations, as well as more considerations of climate change into the planning process. But we were aware through reviewing much of the natural hazards literature that much of the mitigation focus over the years has been on bricks and mortar. And so it's been on physical infrastructure with less of a focus on the social world and the social infrastructure and social networks and population characteristics within the communities where the quote unquote bricks and mortar exist. And so one of the things we were trying to do in this project was really to merge those considerations and think about the people in the places and how we can strengthen infrastructure while we're also helping to reduce risk for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So next slide, please. With that context in mind, there has actually been very, very little research that tries to bridge that divide and to essentially bring together a social science and an engineering and a planning lens. the esteemed urban planner, Dr. John Cooper at Texas A&M University, as part of his master's thesis, was actually one of the first about 20 years ago who actually did an analysis of 90 local hazard mitigation plans. And one of the things that John found in his work was that socially vulnerable populations were rarely represented. He went on later with his advisor, Dr. Phil Burke, also an esteemed hazard mitigation planner, and other colleagues to develop a framework to actually account for vulnerabilities and capacities of different populations, with a key principle being the need to define socially vulnerable populations within these hazard mitigation plans. And John, Phil, and colleagues actually used this framework and looked at several different localities to look for best case scenarios where the integration of social vulnerability was actually happening within hazard mitigation planning processes, so they could provide some templates for other localities who were seeking to bring this sort of social lens to hazard mitigation planning. Over the years, we've seen more and more studies have started to emerge in this area, although the literature is still limited in terms of the focus on disproportionate impacts of populations and how that should influence hazard as well as climate change planning moving forward. Next slide, please. And so ultimately, at the heart of this project was this question about, we wanted to understand how state hazard mitigation plans characterize socially vulnerable populations, as well as measure social vulnerability as a concept. We also wanted to understand both quantitatively as well as qualitatively which populations are actually included, or, as you're going to hear from Mary and Chani, are excluded in state hazard mitigation plans. And so overall, we were trying to understand this integration as social vulnerability as a concept, as well as potentially socially vulnerable people within the hazard mitigation planning process. And so next slide, please. And so now I'm going to turn the mic back to Mary Angelica, who's going to talk about our methods that ultimately culminated in the generation of the data set that we were invited to talk about today. So Mary, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Lori Peak. And I'm really excited to talk about the methods part of our development of our data set, because as a Design Safe awardee and Design Safe being really important in integrating social science into the hazards data world. I'm hoping that some of the people who are here or are watching this video who might not be a social scientist might learn about some of our methodological approaches when it comes to finding and understanding data for our specific fields. And so with that, what we did was what we call a content analysis. So a content analysis is essentially a study of documents, or what might be referred to as communication artifacts. So these could be photographs, speeches, or other types of like oral communication. And we wanted to assess, using this methodology, the prevalence of words or identify patterns and themes. And you do this in a systematic fashion or a systematic manner. It's actually very scientific. And what we wanted to do with using this methodology is actually understand whether socially vulnerable populations were mentioned in the context of risk within plans in the first place. So this is as simple as a mention or a not mention. But we also wanted to understand the different places in plans that socially vulnerable populations are mentioned. There are various sections and various amounts of lengths when it comes to state hazard mitigation plans. They vary in their content and their organization. So like, where are these populations talked about in addition to their mention in the plans in the first place? And the other thing we wanted to document is actual direct quotes. So to show the language that is used to discuss these specific populations that are at risk. So what are the types of things that are considered around these populations? What are the statistics that are used? How are they discussed within the plans? These were all things we wanted to understand from these documents. So as we mentioned previously, the documents we reviewed were are all of these state hazard mitigation plans, which are publicly available for all 50 states and 5 inhabited U.S. territories. Washington, D.C. does not make their state hazard mitigation plan public, so we skipped Washington, D.C. And all of them came in a PDF format with the exception of New York, who has like an interactive website in which they publish their plan. And so we use that to do this research and do this content analysis. Importantly, we looked at state hazard mitigation plans from 2016 to 2021, so within that time period. So that doesn't account for some of the most recent updates that most plans had to be updated in 2023 or 2024. However, we were hoping that with our collection of data, some of these quotes and mentions could help inform some of those state hazard mitigation plans or future development of state hazard mitigation plans by states, territory, or even local governments that also have hazard mitigation plans. So our data collection process, so we had those publicly available through those different agency websites. So state hazard mitigation plans, as states have different departments at which they keep their hazard mitigation plan under, some under an emergency management agency, others under other. So we were able to collect all those plans for the 50 state and 5 territories and put those within our own folder, our own database. And once we had that, our research team had gathered multiple researchers to identify these key terms and themes. And we used a quality control, quality assurance methodology to double check mentions at various stages throughout the research project, because we weren't just looking for the words in themselves, but the context that they were mentioned in. For example, there might be the name of an agency, such as the Department of Veteran Affairs, where they name that perhaps in an appendix, but they don't actually talk about veterans within the context of risk. So we had to check and make sure those things were consistent, that they were part of that conversation. And so so we did those throughout the study, but we also did pre and post checks across random plans as well when it came to trying to understand mentions as well as those contextual quotes. And so moving to contextual quotes, we also collected contextual quotes to help to highlight these key concepts and consideration for social vulnerability. Because again, it wasn't just about the mention of the term, it was also about the context at which it was mentioned, discussed, and how plans plan to reduce risk for these specific populations. Throughout the phase of the qualitative data collection, we continuously checked for errors in the first phase of the data collection while updating the quantitative data further. So actually, as we were gathering quotes, we went back and also double checked our mentions as well. So I think the important point here is that we had a multiple person research team, but we also used that opportunity and the length of the research to go back and double check our work as well. So that's an important part of this content analysis. And last, we also conducted a descriptive statistical analysis. So we took both the quantitative data and the qualitative data, and we used that to do a analysis for a paper, which we will preview in the end, to look at socially vulnerable populations and these contextual factors. All right, so with that, we're going to get into the findings, and as possibly the first undergraduate presenter for the Design Safe presentation, I'm passing it over to Chani.
Thank you, Mary. All right, so I'm going to present the findings for you guys today, specifically the key findings from the data set. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So these were, as Mary mentioned, for us sourced by the collection of these contextual quotes, descriptively analyzed and statistically analyzed. So what exactly is the prevalence of social vulnerability? So the data set concerned itself with how many state hazard mitigation plans, as we've defined as SHMPs, referenced anything regarding social vulnerability from 2016 to 2021. And we did determine that 60% of these SHMPs referenced something about social vulnerability. If we can fly into the next quote. Okay, and before I go ahead and read that quote, 40% of the SHMPs actually had no reference to to the social vulnerability. So here we've included a quote about what exactly we define as social vulnerability from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This was extracted from the Minnesota SHMP. So social vulnerability as the resilience of communities when confronted by external stresses on human health, stresses such as natural or human-caused disasters or disease outbreaks. So this is how the Centers for Disease Control define social vulnerability. Okay, if we can fly into the next quote. Thank you. So we also determined that 49% of the SHMPs included a social vulnerability index, or SVI, as previously defined. This tool measures and located socially vulnerable populations. So here's the diagram of the SVI used in 3 of the SHMPs from the data set. We have factors like socioeconomic status, disability, minority status, and language as a barrier. And then we also have transportation, just to name a few. And then we also have these subsections of what these larger identified vulnerabilities are, such as the distinction between populations aged 65 and older, as well as those aged 17 or younger. If we can go on to the next. Thank you. So what populations did these SHMPs and the SVIs identify as most prominently vulnerable? So we determined that all the states and territories that we've analyzed mentioned the elderly in their SHMPs. And we can fly into the next. Thank you. And here is an extracted quote from one of the data sets that we've sampled from Hawaii, which specifically determines the elderly population and identifies them as vulnerable. So the elderly are more apt to lack the physical and economic resources necessary for response to hazard events and are more likely to suffer health-related consequences, making recovery slower. The language used in this Hawaii SHMP is sort of an example of how other SHMPs have also talked about the elderly population throughout and identified them as socially vulnerable. We can fly in the next quote. So in addition to the elderly, there were also other populations who were prevalently identified as socially vulnerable. For example, we had children, people with disabilities, and people living in poverty, all which were within 70 to 80% statistically referenced throughout the data set. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in contrast to these more prevalently identified populations, such as the elderly and the children, we also had some populations mentioned a lot less. For instance, we had the non-English speaking populations, racial minorities, vulnerable workers, and occupation-related vulnerability, populations with language barriers, as well as ethnic minorities. All of these populations were referenced with less than 50% of the time. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. And then we also had some populations which were mentioned even less than that, often including women and gender minorities, the LGBTQAI population, refugees, prisoners, immigrants, religious minorities, and populations who have substance dependency. We can fly in. And then we also, interestingly, had populations who were not identified at all, like the veterans. We can go to the next slide. So in addition to collecting these vulnerability statistics in terms of the population characteristics, we also collected data from other vulnerability dimensions, such as transportation, location, and housing. So for example, we have some of the statistics associated with the mobile and manufactured homes at 50.9%, rural areas at 49.1%, those who do not have access to vehicles at 23.6%, and those without uninsured housing at 7.3%, if we can fly into the quote. So here's a sample quote that we extracted from the Mississippi SHMP. It's sort of a sample language that these SHMPs used to describe vulnerability in terms of this dimension. So those who live in mobile homes are particularly vulnerable, for without the appropriate warning or access to tornado shelter, they can rapidly become involved in a life-threatening situation. We can go on. Thank you. So we also, which Lori had mentioned earlier, saw references to tribal areas. Statistically, it was 29.1% of the time. Here's a sample quote from the Oklahoma SHMP, which sort of exemplifies the ways with which this SHMP might communicate and identify tribal areas as socially vulnerable. So while tribal communities have adapted to climate change for centuries, they are now constrained by physical and political boundaries. Traditional ecosystems and native resources no longer provide the support that they used to. This is the language with which the Oklahoma SHMP identified the tribal area as socially vulnerable. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So overall, the findings from the data set did identify what populations were considered socially vulnerable, how state officials and persons in the fields of hazards and disasters communicate these vulnerabilities and also identify these vulnerabilities. But I think what I found really interesting and important from the findings was that it indicates that major work can be done to increase inclusivity of these populations and awareness of the populations that aren't spoken about in the fields of hazards and disasters, and the ones that the SHMPs tended to not include as much. So thank you, and I'll go and pass it back to Mary and Lori.
Thank you so much, Chani. Thank you for that wonderful summation of our findings. And I hope the description, setting the stage that Lori did a wonderful job doing, and some of the descriptions of our findings that Chani did a great job doing, and our data collection as well, that you are appetized to go read our paper and see our data set. And so I just wanted to provide those resources for you up on the screen. So the first thing I want to mention is our paper. We have a paper called State Hazard Mitigation Plans and Social Vulnerability, the same as this presentation, so hopefully not difficult to find. And it's in the Journal of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and it is available with that DOI link below. It was just published, I believe, earlier this year, so hot off the presses. So if you can read more about our findings, specific quotes, the methodology, there if you want to learn more, and find some of the other resources that we also cited in the beginning of the slide are also cited in our paper as well. And as Scott alluded to at the very beginning, we do have our Design Safe project, which is PRJ 4241. This is a screenshot of our data, and we have available them both in the qualitative. So those were some of the quotes that Chani was talking about, as well as the quantitative data, which gets more into those like binary statistics, but also some other very interesting statistics in there for you to explore from these hazard mitigation plans. And with that, I also want to acknowledge some other people at the Natural Hazard Center. Simran Shirodi and Drew Sett were also part of our undergraduate research team for the quantitative data collection. And Heather Champeau, who is also a graduate research assistant, also helped to support this project as well. And again, we were funded by a philanthropic organization that asked to be unnamed, but we also had the support of the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder as well. And we would like to thank all of those for their help and support with this project. And thank you. This is thank you to the audience, but also a special big thank you to Design Safe and what you're doing for social science research. As also a data ambassador, as well as Lori Peak, we are always big promoters of this work and hope to continue seeing the success of Design Safe for the infrastructure and for researchers who use it. So thank you.
All right, thanks very much for an awesome presentation. We do have time for questions. So there's two ways that you can ask questions if you'd like to. One is to use the Q&A feature down on the bottom, or another way is if you'd like to just ask your question, just raise your hand using the reactions feature down at the bottom, and I can ask you to unmute yourself and talk. I think I'm co-host, so I can do that for you. All right, I'm monitoring it now. Maybe as people think of their questions, I did have one was curious about going through this. I was just thinking about local hazard mitigation plans and how they relate to the state hazard mitigation plans. So, did you find cases where a state hazard mitigation plan would require local jurisdictions, cities or counties or whatever smaller units develop these hazard plans to consider socially vulnerable populations within their own area?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Unless you had an answer, Lori, I was just going to run with this. Yeah, so just like the state hazard mitigation plans themselves, those relationships between the state and local when it comes to hazard mitigation planning also varies. States are supposed to, or I don't want to say supposed to, but it's encouraged that states support their localities in the development of their own hazard mitigation plans that reflect the state's priorities, as well as kind of the guidance from states to develop in their local hazard mitigation plans, as well as adopt things that are specific for their local plan. And just to clarify, when we say local plan, we mean at the county level. That's the local hazard mitigation plan. Some states are incredibly involved. Their state hazard mitigation officer, so let's say SHMO, is a full-time employee. They work completely on hazard mitigation. They work closely with local government officials, whether that's a county commissioner or a county emergency manager, to develop their plan. Some also offer templates. So you will see some states where the cover of every local hazard mitigation plan is the same, except it changes the county name because they're using the template, which is not a bad thing. It's just that the template is offered there. And localities are able to use that to guide their planning. And in other states, they're very hands-off. And that has to do with like how their planning is done. So in some states, they don't have a full-time SHMO. They don't have a full-time state hazard mitigation officer. That person might work part-time. That person might have a whole other job. There are states when like the state, like some state person, like a prosecutor, or not a prosecutor, but like the state version of a sheriff, I don't know what I'm trying to think of, is like also part-time the hazard mitigation officer. And so they have another full-time job, and they rely on things like partnerships with universities or contracts to help with the development of their state hazard mitigation plan. And they might not have the capacity to help with local hazard mitigation planning. There might be like the will there. There might be resources maybe available for that, but they just don't have the time because they're wearing so many hats. And so like there's this, as much as there's variation within state hazard mitigation plans, the relationships to local government and to local planning and to local entities, government agencies that help with the planning varies a lot. So Lori, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's my understanding.
No, just thank you, Mary. That was wonderful. And Scott, that is a great question. And I think the only thing I would add to that, and tying back to the data set, is the sort of variability that Mary just described is also sort of reflected in some of the other data that we include in the data set. So for example, one of the things that we found is that these state hazard mitigation plans, they range in length from anywhere from less than 100 pages to nearly 1,000 pages. And so as Chani is nodding, because she was one of the valiant research team members who poured through every single page of these plans. And so the variability that Mary's describing there is also related to sort of the level of detail within these plans themselves. And so the ones that were much lengthier, oftentimes they did have more of those local to state level connections. They'd even perhaps prioritized projects. The states had prioritized projects at the local level. And so, Scott, I just think it's such an important feedback loop that you're highlighting. And one of the big carrots for why localities should, we hope, develop these robust local hazard mitigation plans, because then that can feed in to the state hazard mitigation plan as the states are making their decisions about prioritization. But as Mary noted, that is just highly variable across states and is determined by culture, by resources, and so forth. So yeah, thank you for asking us about that.
And if it's okay, can I add just one thing to that? To entice you to go read our paper, we also have some vignettes of different state hazard mitigation plans and specific things that they do very well around social vulnerability. We highlight a few states in there, as Lori mentioned, that there's quite a variability, but there are some states that even go above and beyond what is required. There is a thing called an enhanced hazard mitigation plan. And if you meet an extra set of criteria, a different set pot of money opens up for you around mitigation. But enhanced plans in states that have an enhanced plans, don't know off the top of my head what the percentage is, but it's not a ton of them, maybe like a third are enhanced, maybe less than that. I think less than that.
Yeah, I had a question that was tied to that funding too. I think Lori mentioned that only 30% of tribal areas have a hazard mitigation plan. Does that prevent them from applying for federal funding, or can they apply under the state plan? Like if the tribal area is entirely contained within a boundary of a state, does that allow them to apply under that plan, or do they really need their own?
That is a great question, and two responses to that. So one of the things I'm very pleased to report on was that the statistic that I shared there, Lucy Carter wrote her and published her thesis in 2016. In the years since then, the percent of FEMA approved tribal mitigation plans has increased over time, and a lot of that has to do with FEMA really investing in having a tribal liaison work and so forth, but it's still not 100% as it is at the state and territorial level. And so that's just one thing that I wanted to say, that there has absolutely been progress in that regard, but there's still more work to be done. And then secondly, to your point, Scott, there are different mechanisms through which tribes or other entities can apply for funding, but it becomes more complicated, less streamlined, and fewer dollars will likely flow and will flow more slowly if that approved plan isn't in place. And so I think as hazard researchers who are really concerned with closing vulnerability gaps, one of the things that we were really concerned with doing this research is figuring out how can the knowledge and expertise that we have, how might that be applied to help to close those gaps so that localities could be eligible for those funds? And also, as social scientists, how might we be able to use this information to try to include a deepening of understanding and inclusivity when it comes to state hazard mitigation planning as well as local mitigation planning. So thank you. Mary, was something you were going to add?
Yeah, I just also wanted to make a quick point, because you were just talking about an approved plan and the update is every 5 years. But there's room to still update in the interim between those 5 years. I'm not sure, maybe Lori, you know the circumstances when they allow that to happen. But as you notice, the time period we had was 2016 to 2021. And when the COVID pandemic started in 2020, many states didn't have pandemics in their hazard mitigation plan. In fact, as a field, we were kind of going back and forth of like, is our pandemics natural hazards? What are you going to do? But we just call those non-climactic hazards. So I think that's where we settled. So there is room for updates because you'll see some of those plans that are in 2021. I believe I showed the cover of Puerto Rico's, which was updated in 2021, and I believe they have pandemics and COVID written in there as well. So I know there's room to update in between that 5-year update, but I'm not, maybe Lori, if you know the circumstances of what that can happen, or if that's just like a request they can make or something like that. So I just want to note that too as well, is that the 5 years is required, but you can update it in between.
All right. There was a question in the chat from Shreya. This is being recorded and it'll be available through the Design Safe Learning Center within a few weeks. So it'll definitely be there. Well, thanks very much to the three of you for being here. I haven't seen any questions come through or hands up. Let me check again just to make sure. Okay. So I think that wrap it up here. I'm going to share my screen and just show a few more slides. All right, so the Design Safe Training Archive, which you can find by going to the Design Safe website and clicking on the Learning Center, we'll have a button here. Well, it's actually right here, right, for this webinar. Eventually, this will be put onto our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to watch it back, which is great. So thanks for that. One thing I wanted to mention, we have a new program this summer called the NERI Spark program, which is a strategic program to accelerate researchers in computing. So if you'd like to use Design Safe resources, but kind of don't know how or something like that, or you want to bring a workflow to us, we'll have this event July 16th through 18th in Austin. And so application window is open now for that, if that's something that you're interested in. And again, we appreciate your feedback. So please scan the QR code and complete the survey for us when you have a moment. And I'll leave that up for just a second. All right, and oh, it's there too. So thanks very much, Mary Angelica, Lori, and Chani for being here. This was really great. Thanks also to Ellen Rathje, the PI of Design Safe, and Tim and Charlie, Dan, Tracy, Hedda, and especially Natalie for being here and helping to organize the webinar. And feel free to look us up on Slack. You can email us, fill out a ticket if you have problems using Design Safe. And thanks everybody for being here. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott and Natalie. And great job, Mary and Chani. I'll see you both